Hello and welcome, everyone. I am Aubrey Reeves, CEO of Business and Arts. Before we before we begin, I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm a settler speaking to you from Takaranto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat peoples and the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee confederacies, most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. By saying the names of its original keepers, we remember that this territory continues to be subject to the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We acknowledge all who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on these lands. Earlier this summer, I was honored to be asked to read an advanced copy of The Audacity of Relevance by Alex Sarian and to provide a short blurb on what I thought of the book. And what I thought was that this book was essential reading for arts managers everywhere, and that we definitely had to get Alex onto the Business and Arts Speaker Series to share some of the key ideas in the book. So I'm very excited about today's discussion between Alex Sarian and Rohan Kulkarni. They're going to dig into some of the big themes in the book, from arts education to what is the value proposition of the arts and how we should be building new audiences. I can't wait. But first, a big thanks to Power Corporation of Canada, who is the presenting sponsor of the Business and Arts Speaker Series. Now, a few housekeeping items. We're happy to have ASL interpretation for today's session, and auto-generated English and French captions can also be turned on in your control panel. Only the speakers and moderator will have our microphones on today, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. The session is scheduled for 1 hour. So now let me introduce you to our moderator for today's session. Rohan Kulkarni is an arts manager, educator, and community builder based in Toronto. As the Director of Education and Community Engagement at Soulpepper Theatre, he designs and oversees the company's renowned emerging artist training programs, including the Soulpepper Academy. He leads the organization's transformation into a cultural hub by implementing innovative approaches to space activation and reimagining the purpose of a theater in its community. He is also passionate about mentorship and serves on the board of directors for LGBT Youthline. Rohan is part of Business and Arts' Emerging Leadership Program, which recognizes the next generation of senior leaders in Canada's cultural sector. So welcome, and over to you, Rohan.
So much, Aubrey. And I just want to take a moment to thank Aubrey and the Business Arts team for organizing all of this. It's been a wonderful experience so far and can't wait to get started. Without further ado, I'll introduce Alex. So Alex Sarian, our guest for today, Alex Sarian joined Arts Commons as president and CEO in May 2020 after 7 years of executive leadership roles at Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. In addition to overseeing the 13-acre facility in downtown Calgary, he also leads the single largest cultural infrastructure project in Canadian history, the $660 million Arts Commons Transformation Project. Scheduled to break ground in December 2024, ACT has already exceeded 75% of its fundraising goal, having recently secured the country's largest philanthropic gift ever made to the performing arts. His new book, The Audacity of Relevance, Critical Conversations on the Future of Arts and Culture by ECW Press, is already praised as being, quote, a manifesto for the arts in times of crises, unquote. Welcome, Alex. It's good to have you.
Thanks, Rohan. Thanks for having me. And thanks, Aubrey and Business and Arts for hosting this conversation.
Absolutely. So, Alex, let's dive right in. This book, it's such a fascinating read, and it kind of feels like an affirmation, a challenge, a real provocation about how we're going to navigate the next few years. Because just for the context which you acknowledge rightly in the book is we've all been, as a sector struggling. People have been shouting from the rooftops that we're in trouble, and now we're trying to figure out how to go forward. So a big part of this is value proposition. Value proposition, and how do we sort of tell the story about what we do in an inspiring way. So that's not an easy task. I just want to just start by maybe having a little bit of a dialogue about what is this value proposition and why should all arts organizations kind of be obsessed with it in this moment?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and it all starts from the value proposition. And it's funny because I know I was told not to look at the chat box, but I can't help myself, and I'm seeing all these names and friends and um and a lot of change makers in the Canada arts community that are part of this conversation. Um, I think it's no secret that we need to change, and I think we've been having to change for decades. Somebody actually said to me last week, generations, and I don't disagree. Um, I think there's this idea that, sometimes we can change because we want to, and sometimes we change because we have to. And I think a lot of organizations have been doing this work, and I want to acknowledge that. A lot of the conversations in this book, a lot of the anecdotes in this book are not necessarily new, and a lot of people have been doing this work. I just think we find ourselves at a point in history, in our country's history, in our sector's history, where we have to think about this change, because if we don't, we will be out of business. Um, I think we've noticed a lot of trends become accelerated post-pandemic that are impacting our ability to do business, increased, rising costs, an increased dependency on earned revenues, a very competitive philanthropic landscape. These things are not new to many of us, but I think the pandemic has accelerated it in such a way where many of us are now having to have these conversations. And so, in the urgency of the moment, part of what this book does, it calls on us to sort of take a step back and say, yes, we need to do these things because there's an urgency to it, but let's also take a moment to reflect on the value proposition required. And at the end of the day, one of the things that I find hope in is that I believe in my heart of hearts that the value proposition we need to lean into as a sector is that of being in service to others, of having to define our success through the lens of impact and relevance. And what I love about it, and what I find hope in that, is 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 that we actually don't need to be the smartest people in the room. The solution can be found in community, in conversation, in dialogue with others. And I find that terribly exciting. I find that terribly hopeful. But I also acknowledge that if that's how we define the work that is to be done, that's not that's not what the work has been for cultural institutions for the past 60 years. And so there needs to be this evolution. But to your point, Rohan, it does start with the value proposition at its core.
Yeah, and I guess the question really, so I'm at Soulpepper, and we just
Mhm.
announced a 3-year new strategic plan, which in some ways we're talking, at least internally, it's actually not a revolution. It's actually an evolution of stuff that we're already doing, stuff that we're already good at, things that we are kind of implementing in the day to day. So in a way, you do emphasize in the book that there is this real importance about putting the work in and not just talking about it right up front and then sort of building the house and waiting for
Yeah.
for it all to come together. It's really that authenticity of values that should lead this.
Well, and also, I want to call out Soulpepper because you did announce it last week, and I think it's beautiful, and I think it's exactly the kind of work that needs to be done. I also want to give a shout out, just because it's a recent example, to the city of Toronto that put out a culture plan also last week. And what I love about that culture plan is that it starts actually by outlining the evolution of the city of Toronto. It actually says, here's how Toronto has evolved demographically. Here's who we are today. And so as a result, here is how our cultural plan should align with that. That is very much what's happening in Calgary. That's very much what's happening in Arts Commons. We are, we're sort of taking a step back and saying, what does it mean to be in service of these communities that surround us today? Um, and even if you were this is what I love about relevance. Even if you were successful at it yesterday, it's changing. There are many things I love about the concept of relevance. The first one is you never truly arrive, and if you have arrived, it will be a fleeting moment because the world changes, and so we need to change along with it. The second thing I love about the concept of relevance is that you don't ever get to decide whether or not whether you have achieved relevance. Much like trust, relevance is bestowed upon you, whether personally or institutionally. And so it forces a sense of institutional humility that I think is needed within our sector, not just in Canada, but I think around the world, where we have built these models and organizations and weird sense of leadership around feeling like we needed to have the answers, like we needed to be arbiters of excellence and arbiters of what people wanted to see, and these tastemakers. And while it might have served us over the past 50, 60 years, um, although some might argue it hasn't, the reality today is very, very different. And so you're right. You look around and Soulpepper is doing it, the city of Toronto is doing it, the city of Calgary is doing it. And again, many of the folks on this chat are doing it as well. I think we're, as a community, we need to be a little less shy about it. And I think those of us that have been doing the work, and I know that our mutual background is in education, and there are a lot of people on this chat that come from a background in education and community engagement. I think it's time for those folks to stop feeling like they need to live sort of in the far corners of the institution and bring those value propositions and those value systems a little more into the forefront.
And that's really interesting that you say that, Alex. Like I, having done this work for some time, it just feels like now maybe people are people like you, other folks, like the vision that's happening at Soulpepper, it's actually sort of recognizing and bringing that work to the center, because it is, well, in some ways that has always been the beating heart of a lot of arts organizations, but perhaps did not receive the attention or the funding or the attention past the when the funding ask is made in the name of youth, in the name of whatever community purpose that we serve. So I guess how does one go about navigating that transition of messaging, which in a way that still feels authentic to the company and what it's putting out?
Well, I think, it starts with the value proposition. It starts with the strategy. And one of the things I loved about wrapping my head around this book is that it mirrors beautifully the work that we're doing at Arts Commons, because it starts with that value proposition. It starts with that, why are we doing this and who are we doing it for? And these are big questions. They might be relatively simple and straightforward questions, but they're pretty big. And then this radiation of just decision making needs to come out of there. So, for example, who are we doing this for? What do we stand for? How does our programming align? How do our operations align? And what I love about this book and the process of writing it is it takes the value proposition, or it takes a reimagined value proposition, and it layers it on top of conversations around programming or the business model or HR or culture or the ideas of belonging, designing. And so it doesn't matter who you are in the arts and sector world. Part of my goal, philanthropy and fundraising for sure, it takes this idea and it says, okay, if you were to make the switch around the narrative we tell, what would success look like in your corner of the institution, regardless of what your job is? And it's important for me to do this because oftentimes I've been having this conversation for 20 years almost. And pre-pandemic, a lot of folks would say to me, oh, that sounds lovely. I can't afford to do that work right now. And I think we've gotten to a point where people need to understand that regardless of what corner of the institution you live in, you can't afford not to do this. And so there are very real practical implications for thinking this way that people need to start, taking risks on and experimenting with. For us at Arts Commons in Calgary, it was really important for me to put this kind of thinking out there because, to your point, we're about to break ground right now on the largest cultural infrastructure project in Canadian history, $660 million. And it was important for me and for my board and for my colleagues that people understood as we look back on this moment in history to say, we're not just building a shiny new facility. This is actually the physical manifestation of a different way of thinking about arts and culture. And so this book, in many ways, not only does it stand alone as great conversations to be having, but it also serves as a companion piece for the work that we're doing through design and construction in Western Canada. So, And fundraising, you talk about fundraising earlier, it's a perfect example. If we haven't cracked the nut on what our story is, if we can't tell, which I find ironic, right? Because we're storytellers, but if we can't tell our story in a way that taps into the zeitgeist of our current moment in time, then why should we expect people to buy tickets? Why should we expect people to open up their wallets and be generous? Why should we expect governments and I think we need to move away from this idea that, oh, because we're special, or oh, because we deserve it, or oh, and yes, those things might be true, but the nonprofit sector is growing at a ridiculously fast pace, and the resources to support it are not there. So whether we want to or not, our world is becoming more competitive. And I actually find that very healthy because in some ways it is asking us, and it's putting the onus on us as leaders in our field to say, how do we evolve our missions? How do we evolve our sector? And how do we raise the bar to be better at what people need us to be? And there's a phrase in the book that says, we need to stop asking ourselves what we are good at and start asking what we're good for. And I think making that switch isn't a threat to our mission. It's actually an opportunity to sort of reinvent it.
I mean, it sounds wonderful, Alex. I'm just wondering about, the variety of stakeholders that are involved in any given change that happens. And yeah, I have this idea that this book is a great read for leaders. I'm trying to think how do we actually go about creating this message and making it feel real to people in ways that they can actually experience, because when we talk about the change it can be very inspiring, but the truth of it is in the day to day, a lot of folks, whether it's you're talking about leaders or you're even talking about folks who are throughout dispersed throughout the organization, and we know nonprofit culture, the culture sector is notorious for 2 to 3 year lifespans for staff and things like that, where we have people who may not be as bought into the sort of idea of it. How do you propose we navigate through, again, what it could be board members, it could be audiences, it could be staff, it could be any number of people, that we take these ideas and are able to disperse them through the organization in real functional ways?
So what I love about your question, so 10 years ago, we were asking people to take a leap of faith with these ideas. Today, the proof is out there. You look at organizations like Soulpepper, you look at organizations like Arts Commons and the work that we're doing with, the fact that we were able to fundraise as much as we have during the pandemic. What's funny right now is that post-pandemic, there's this bifurcation of almost these two alternative realities. You have a world in which organizations are pivoting and innovating, and I'll talk about these words later because they mean very little to me, but you have a reality in which organizations are evolving with the times and not just keeping up, but leading. You have, in that same world, you have also an evolution of consumer behavior, right? You have people that are literally going into debt to have cultural experiences. You have philanthropy on the rise because of, issues around the world. Like there is a world in which all of the things that we need to succeed are happening. Some of those things are happening within arts and culture. Some of those things are happening outside of them, but there's tangible proof that success is being experienced by some people in some sectors. The alternative reality, which is being experienced literally at the same time, is companies struggling and going out of business or cutting seasons or people getting burnt out. And I don't mean to imply, I'm not saying that flippantly because it's very serious and it's detrimental to not only the health of our organizations, but our health as people and professionals personally. But you can now point to something and say, guys, if we don't do that, and by that, I mean, like literally look over there, look at those people that are doing it. I think it's a much easier, or I hope it's a much easier conversation to have with stakeholders because you can look across the street and say, those people have been doing it and they're probably in much better shape than we are. So it's no longer asking people to take a leap of faith. It's asking people to respond to trends that seem to be working. And I hope there's some confidence in that. And I hope, and there's no shame in not being an early adopter. There's no shame in not being the first ones to take the leap of faith. But others have been doing it and have been experiencing varying degrees of success. I kind of think it's irresponsible for organizations that are still struggling to not want to try this. And let's be real, a lot of the reason we're trying these things is because the status quo has not been working. So to say that we're going to dig our heels in and not experiment or not take risks or not do certain things differently at a moment in time like the one that we are in now, that just makes no sense to me.
And I'd love, Alex, for you to talk just, about one case in particular, which I love, is this has happened already in the case of libraries. And what do we learn from libraries? What is it that, you spend a great deal of time in the book talking about libraries. So I just want to hear a bit more about what are they doing right, and at what point did they decide their value proposition was going to adjust, and how did they enact that in community, essentially?
I think libraries as a sector have been grappling with this, maybe not longer than we have, but they've been leaning into they've been leaning into the discomfort of this conversation for longer than we have. Libraries around the world, with the democratization of information, have become less. You don't need to go there to check out a book. You don't need to go there to look up information. And so library systems around the world have been grappling with, well, if that's not who we are, and if we're not sort of the source of this transactional relationship with people, then who are we? And I like to think that libraries, if I could think about libraries having these sort of like secret convenings, or like these, at some point, these people got together and said, we can either call it a day and say we've achieved our mission and sunset and call it a success, or we can zoom out and we can push the boundaries of our mission and redefine who it is that we are, so that we are in constant need, so that we are a constant service to the communities that we serve. And so now you look at libraries as being a place where information is not just gathered, but shared. And so the sharing of information necessitates the building of community. And you may not be gathering information from books or computers, but you might be gathering information from other people. And so, I look at the library system in Norway as a library system that has been getting it right for many, many years. But I also actually start the book by interviewing the CEO of the Calgary Public Library System. For those of you that have never been to Calgary, when you do come, make sure that one of the first places you go to is our downtown library, because not only is it a beacon of what libraries can mean for people, but it's also an example of what happens when you challenge yourself to evolve and meet the needs of the communities that surround you. And I remember when I was interviewing for my job at Arts Commons, I was in from New York, and I remember saying to my wife, I was like, listen, if Calgary can do this with the library system, then it can do it with the Performing Arts Center. And so the other thing about this book that I love, and the conversations in it, is that it's always engaging in conversations with people that are on the periphery of our world. So the library sector, the for-profit. I mean, one of the chapters is interviewing the head of HR at Twitter when Elon Musk joined. So we're asking others about concepts of relevance in their own sector and trying to learn from each other, which in some ways is what we should be doing every day.
Absolutely. And I will say very plainly that I take some of my best ideas from libraries, because all the great successes that they've had, because part of the work that we're doing here at Soulpepper is really just trying to, again, imagine what our value proposition would be, as, as inherently people that a company that brings people together, that creates a space for storytelling, and using that sort of as a North Star, because that feels we excel at it on our stages, we excel at it in our youth programs, we excel at it in our adult workshops and classes, and just opening up space for many different reasons. So there's so many wonderful examples out there of people who have done this work, that I think we need to be much more open to borrowing, and there's also a lot of information and studies that people have done and people have written.
it also means we don't need to be the smartest people in the room.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, and what a wonderful lesson is that, right? So it's like it forces us to redefine what leadership means. It means that we are, I talk a lot about the fact that we need, as a sector and as leaders within our sector, we need to stop assuming like we are entitled to have all the answers, and we need to instead create the space in which questions can be answered um, uh, collectively and with a sense of community in mind, and that our role, whether as an arts organization, whether we are producing, whether we're presenting, whether we are a venue for others, is that we are creating space within which innovation can take place as defined by others, not necessarily us. And I think that, we also talk about sustainability in our business model. I can't think of a more powerful way to invite people into defining what success should look like for our institutions than by hosting and gathering rather than, hosting, gathering, asking rather than telling.
Hmm. And Alex, I'm just, we share a lot of our philosophical, I would say, approaches to how we do this work, but it's not by accident because, you have a very strong background in arts education and community work. And I'm really thinking about what positions you as someone to sort of have all these amazing opinions about this topic of relevance, and how sort of your origins in this work really set you up to be thinking about these things on a larger scale. And now that you're, heading a large performing arts center, how does that work continue to drive you through this?
Yeah, I mean, so listen, I was meant to be a first grade teacher. Like my undergrad was, and I loved it. And one of the things I loved about teaching in the classroom was that if you notice a student not getting it, it's never the student's fault. And so my upbringing in education was constantly forcing me to reevaluate how it was that I was trying to reach people. And if I wasn't reaching them, it was never their fault. It was always a challenge to me to say, okay, what do I need to change about myself and my teaching practice in order to make sure that more people were getting it? Um, in a very sort of windy way, I ended up in the arts and I ended up in arts administration, but always working in education, right? And so what's interesting to me, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I actually left arts education for a while, which for those of you that are on this call and you work in arts education, you're like, you mean we can go somewhere else other than arts education? Because it usually feels like we're trapped in this world, and we can have a whole conversation around sort of the career pipeline of arts educators in this world that we call sort of nonprofit arts. But I actually I had the incredible opportunity to consult with organizations around the US and around the world. And I remember I'd be sitting in these meetings with, the artistic director and the CEO and the board chair and all the staff. And, and mind you, this was pre-pandemic. And a lot of the clients were saying, okay, how do we market our work differently? Or how do we fundraise differently? Or how do we, a lot of it fell under the umbrella, the very vague umbrella of audience development. I hate the term audience development because if I take it back to my childhood, like my education experience, saying audience development is like saying the kid needs to learn how to learn. And I'm like, no, it's on me to teach better. Anyways, so we'd have all these clients and they wanted to know, well, how do we fundraise better? How do we develop audiences better? And to me, what the common thread was in all of these clients was they were struggling to remain relevant, or they were struggling to reinvent their relevance. And what's interesting to me is that I'd look around the room and everybody was scratching their heads and they're like, yeah, how do we do it? How do we do it? How do we do it? There was always at least one person in the room that looked very frustrated because they had figured it out. Or maybe if they hadn't figured it out, they were closer to a solution than most of their peers were. And that person was usually the director of education or the director of community engagement. Because these are people whose professions depend on reconciling an institution's mission with the organization's ability to connect with others. And so I had this aha moment where I said, and mind you, this was probably 10 years ago, and I had this aha moment where I was like, if only we could get the work that is happening within these education departments or community engagement departments and elevate that value proposition within every corner of the institution, not to make it an educational institution, mind you, but to bring that commitment to civic engagement and civic dialogue into the higher offices within that institution. And so, I start the chapter on education by asking this very large hypothetical question: what would happen to the DNA of an organization if somebody with a background in education was in the CEO's office? And in many ways, I mean, I never grew up being able to look at somebody, a mentor of mine, that grew up in education and then held the CEO office. And if that was the case, I think it's few and far between. So I like to joke that, the jury's still out on whether it's a good idea. And I say that somewhat jokingly because I have peers and board members and bosses on this call, but they took a chance, and I'd like to think that while I may not have the answers, I feel like at least I know what questions to ask.
Absolutely. And speaking of questions, I'll just give a quick interjection, folks. If you do have questions, you can pop them in the Q&A portion. We'll be taking some questions at the end. We have a few minutes still, so please make sure you get your questions in so that we can get to them. Alex, I'd love to talk about this this audience development that we all are so keen on. And at Soulpepper, for example, like we've ever since we came back to in-person performances, something really wild and unexpected has happened, but in a way it makes sense. Is that consistently for all of our shows, over 40 to 50% of our audiences are completely new to the organization. They have never seen a show before. We do pre-show speeches. We say, hello, who's here for the first time? And I kid you not, every single time, more than half of the audience will put up their hand and say, we're new. So while that's amazing, we're trying to figure out what is it that we can do to keep audiences coming back, because clearly there are a lot of new people finding the arts in different ways. And you have that great example in about Arts Commons in the summer of 2022, which you can elaborate on a little bit with the Asian concert series that you did. But I guess my question is, when people come and discover the arts, and they're from perhaps communities that haven't always been welcomed, haven't always been represented in the ways that in the halls of the institutions, let's say, how do we truly extend a welcome and a welcome back to these audiences?
So I talk a lot, and I've been talking about this for years, and it's certainly in the book, this idea of the barriers to engagement and the barriers to participation. The three of them that come to mind and that I always think about are, there's a geographic barrier, which is the barrier that for many of us, we've always sort of dismissed. And I think the pandemic allowed us to experiment with digital technology in a way that was really interesting to overcome some of the geographic barriers. You can think of it as, we can think of overcoming geographic barriers. Many of our organizations will pay for school buses, will pay for transportation. Like we try to make it easier. I think technology has introduced a really new and interesting paradigm shift there. The second one, which is the one we grapple with the most, is the financial barrier. And many of our organizations do incredible discounts or free ticket or pay what you can. But to me, the biggest one is the perceived barrier. And I talk a lot, and my team is probably tired of hearing me say it. If people don't perceive that we belong to them, they're never going to feel like they belong within our facilities or within our shows or our experiences. And so to me, it's that, how do we overcome that perception? And, the example that you talked about in Calgary, and I share this example as just one of many, and I'm sure people on this call could highlight 20 of their own. But when we weren't able to gather people within our venues, we hosted these pop-up concerts throughout Calgary. And we were very intentional, and that's one of my favorite words, is intentionality, but we were very intentional about where we engaged, where we did these pop-up concerts. We would engage with communities where we had no relationships or had smaller relationships. And we would go into communities and we would go into neighborhoods and say, listen, we've heard loud and clear that people are tired of consuming arts and culture digitally. We've heard from the artist community that the gig economy is drying up. And so why can't we leverage whatever resources we have to support local artists to perform for their local communities and audiences in safe outdoor environments? One of the places in which we did that was a lot of communities within the northeast quadrant of Calgary, which is a predominantly Southeast Asian community, or several Southeast Asian communities. They were so incredibly kind and generous and hospitable towards us that as the pandemic restrictions were easing, we were able to go back to them and say, listen, we would like to reciprocate that sense of generosity and hospitality, and we want to be able to bring you into our home. And in doing so, we want you to see the impact that you've had on us. So as this was happening, and this is the summer of 2022 you were referencing, we actually, while many organizations were still struggling to figure out post-pandemic restrictions, we actually had the busiest summer in our 40-year history because we realized that there was a tour manager that was touring Southeast Asian, well-known Southeast Asian artists across Canada, and for whatever reason, historically just skipping over Calgary. And we said, why don't you stop here? It'll help, it'll alleviate your touring costs. And we will do a 15 concert series between May and September, which is a slower time for us. We had tens of thousands of people come to Arts Commons for the first time, many to downtown Calgary for the first time. And mind you, we weren't giving tickets away for free. So it was also a game changer for us financially. And I think that's another thing we can talk about is the assumption that a lot of visible minority communities or marginalized communities, the horrible assumption that they don't have disposable income. And that's a really slippery slope. And so that's the case study you talk about and that I talk about in the book. It's not rocket science, right? It's not like I share these things with a mutual sense of excitement and embarrassment because it worked, but why was that so hard? And so a lot of the anecdotes in this book, it's funny because I get two different responses from people that read the book. The first one is, oh my God, this is brilliant. The second one is, duh. And I think that speaks to the bifurcation of the two realities we're living in where good work is happening. So anyway, so that's the example. Audience development for me it's not about developing an audience. It's not about using arts education to get kids to fall in love. It's about us using these relationships to learn about what it is that people care about, what values drive them, and then how do we incorporate that into our own work so that we're not having to give here, because here's what drives me crazy is, and I mentioned this in the book around the business case, a lot of us are not doing relevant enough work, and then we assume it's a financial barrier, and then we discount the tickets. And I'm like, guys, we're shooting ourselves in the foot twice because not only are we not offering relevant enough programming, but now we're offering it at a discount. And so, which is not to say that overcoming financial barriers is not important. It absolutely is. But as organizations, we need to be able to decipher when are people not coming because they don't care and don't want to spend money versus the financial barriers too large to overcome. So I think we need to put, I come from a world where it's never the consumer's fault. It's not about retraining the audience. It's about retraining how we do things so that people that are spending money on going out and cultural experiences can actually start spending money on us.
Mm. And I could ask so many follow-up questions to that, but I think we are getting close to time. So I'll just talk about one last thing maybe, which is something that we're also really thinking about is fundraising, right? So fundraising is such a huge imperative for our organizations, and I think you say it really interestingly in the book, which is you say that arts organizations would be wise to drop our egos and coalesce around a cause that's bigger than our own, which would be a cause that we connect with by the articulation of a story. How does that manifest into the way that we actually ask people for money? And it feeds into people have money, we're just not asking for it in the right ways.
Yeah. So the chapter on philanthropy is actually an interview with Asha Curran, who's the woman that runs Giving Tuesday around the world. Nobody knows more about sort of philanthropic trends than Asha does. And she says this beautifully in the book. She says, you know, the arts sector loves to talk about donor fatigue. We throw that phrase around a lot. She was like, donors they're not tired of giving. Philanthropy has gone up. If they're fatigued of anything, they're just fatigued of you. And I thought that was such a really sobering thought. And so it puts the onus on us to say, okay, you know, you know, higher education has evolved, healthcare has evolved. Um, you know, although I think everybody's struggling in philanthropy, but I look at the arts and I think we have such a bigger, far more important story to tell about our value in society, about our impact on others. And I don't think I don't think we're telling that story well enough. And 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 not only do I not think we're telling it well enough, there is genuinely a desire sometimes not to. Like I still have conversations with people that say, well, why can't we just fundraise, you know, arts for art's sake? Why can't we just do whatever we want to do? And I always talk about, and one of the guiding questions throughout the book is, and it's a trick questions for obvious reason, but the question is, what's more important, the intent of the artist or the perception of the audience? Because, and obviously it's a trick question because the magic happens when you hold these two things in tension. But I think we have built our sector with the pendulum swinging too far in one direction. And we've never actually stopped to think, well, why is what we do so important? And I think it's okay to talk about the economic impact of the arts. I think it's okay to talk about the social impact of the arts. I think it's great to talk about the impact of the arts on education and creative youth development. That's not watering down what it is we do. It's actually adding weight and currency so that we can tell this story about, and the last thing I'll say before we open it up to questions is, you know, I've been saying this more and more recently, but I wish advocacy, because at the end of the day, telling our story is an exercise in advocacy, whether we're telling it to donors, to foundations, to government, to you know, to audience members. I wish advocacy was more of an exercise in building hope than it seems to be in complaining and begging for money, because if you don't give us money, we'll be out of like that. That might help once, but it's not a sustainable way of building relationships. And ultimately, philanthropy is an exercise in inspiring people and inspiring people through impact. And I know we can do it. And I know many of you already out there are doing it. And those are the folks I think that are experiencing the most amount of success right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great,
Hey,
Aubrey. Well,
Aubrey.
Hi.
right on time.
Yes. Well, I've been listening. We have lots of questions, a lot of exciting discussions in the chat too. There's two questions that are very similar that I'm gonna sort of smush together. Asking about your board, how you engaged your board in this change journey, or how you navigated resistance to change to big ideas in the board.
I know I have board members on this call, and I would say this, it's not hard. When you are saying this is the direction that we need to go in for the sustainability of our organization, you know, taking risks is expensive, but not taking them is you know, a recipe for disaster, I think. To be honest, I think the board has never resisted this idea, because ultimately we are seeking to evolve the organization and redefine success for our organization. And so when you do this right, you should see your numbers go up. Attendance should go up, right? Again, it's, you know, because relevance is always bestowed upon you, you are, you know, and as long as you're always asking and inquiring as to whether you're relevant, then it's just, it's good news. And I will say the biggest point of resistance I have felt is from people saying, you're no longer an arts organization. And I say to people very carefully, like, this is not a black and white conversation. This is not about picking civic responsibility over artistic responsibility, because sometimes I get accused of, oh, you're turning it into like a community center rather than an art center. I still believe firmly in having to achieve excellence in the arts and high standards for the arts, but that needs to be in service to something greater. And so it's not about picking civics over, or culture over arts, or arts over entertainment. It's actually saying we need to invest in artists and in arts organizations. And if they're doing it right, and if they understand that their artistry and their creative process is in service to something bigger, then we only stand to win collectively. Somebody said to me at an event last night, artists are the arbiters of relevance. Nobody understands relevance more than an artist does. I would argue an educator also understands relevance. So our institutions need to make space for these folks that understand that connecting to community through the arts is ultimately that paradigm shift.
Right. Okay, our next question, I think would be great to hear from both of you actually about it. In your experience, what is the best way to communicate relevance to prospective stakeholders and propose risky goals in propelling growth for it? And they put in brackets, if an organization has goals for growth, what is the best way to connect the dots for funders to see the relevance and opportunity for their funds to go toward projects if the proposition is something that perhaps hasn't been done before?
Rohan, do you want to speak about it? I mean, you're going through that right now.
Yeah, I think honestly, it's really not putting the cart before the horse too much. Is if there is a practical possibility of finding as much room for experimentation as you can do, I think that's really important, because people want to be bought into an idea that is sort of already in motion. I'm not asking for people to fund things in order to start something afresh. It's in order to like basically give us the gasoline to really take this to the next level. So I think when the moment that people feel the most inspired is when we can show them the workings of how we do things, how it's accomplishing the outcomes that we are hoping to get, and just honestly inspiring them with a story that says, you could help us take this to the absolute next level. Here's where we are actually struggling or coming up against resources or our capacity. We need to now take this forward, and you got to help us. So I think that's kind of where it really helps to be able to have experiments, real concrete, feedback, consultations, things like that that are in place. And honestly, community members talking well about your work and what you're doing is really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, and the other thing I'd say, and Rohan, I hope that you validate this point, is that a lot of the funders out in society right now, whether they're government, whether they're foundations, whether they're corporate philanthropy, they're actually thinking about this more than we are.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually not about convincing them. It's actually about evolving our way of thinking to catch up to the ways that they're already practicing philanthropy and giving. There's so much low-hanging fruit, right? And so part of it is, not only is it the right thing to do morally, let's call it, it's also a very, not easy, but it's a quick way to start aligning ourselves with people that are in positions of making financial decisions. There was something about your question, or not your question, but somebody's question about scaling up. And I think there is a tendency, and we could do another session on the business model of this, but with costs going up, there is a need to invest in scaling.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony around scaling, and this, you can see, you see this a lot in for-profit. The irony with scaling is that the bigger you get, sometimes the more irrelevant you get, because you're too big to keep your finger on the pulse of what communities want. And so I think it's important for us as organizations, we do need to think about scaling. And there was somebody I interviewed in the book that says, we need to talk about scaling deeply, like scaling needs to be an exercise in going deep rather than going wide. And so we need to talk about scalability so that we can make our work in our sector more efficient. So I think there's efficiency in scalability, but we need to rethink the concept of scalability so that we're actually going deeper within community rather than removing ourselves farther and farther from it, which seems to have been the tendency so far.
Mhm, mhm. You talked about how sort of a different way of thinking about audience development. This person wants to know, what is a better term to replace audience development? They go on to say, what does it mean? What is it supposed to be the objective? And I think you already really tackled that, but what would you want to call it instead of audience development?
Rohan, what do you, I mean, I just think audience development is like this term we created to scapegoat the fact, like to skirt around our responsibility that
Mhm.
people don't want what it is we have to offer.
Yeah, I mean, we just use the word, a lot of the word that we're really focusing on right now is just welcome.
Yeah.
It's as basic as that. It's like we want to be able to feel like a space that's welcoming to people, everyone.
We actually, so yeah, so I'm sorry, I did have an answer to that question. I hate the term audience development. I love the phrase creating arts going habits
Mm,
because it's on us to nurture that, but it puts the onus on us rather than faulting the audiences for not understanding it or not getting it.
yeah, that's really great. Um, This next person says they've been working in arts education and community engagement for almost 40 years. And one question that's always been with her is, we talk about the value of what we do collectively, but then we go back to our organizations and work to build the success of our company, which becomes then competitive with others. Given limited resources and all the challenges that we're facing, what are your thoughts on how we better support each other and work in a way where duplication of programming isn't weighing on the pool of resources?
That's a tough one because I'm going to have
Yeah.
I'm going to have a very unpopular take on this. So the chapter on advocacy in the book um, is with Naheed Nenshi, who, in addition to being former mayor of Calgary, was the first tenure track professor in Canada in nonprofit management. And what Naheed says, and I agree with him, is he says the nonprofit arts community is growing at a far faster pace than the resources allotted to support it. And he's not wrong. The nonprofit community in general has a very hard time sunsetting organizations. And I'd be willing to say that even within that, the subset of arts organizations has an even harder time with the idea of it. And I'm not recommending by any stretch of the imagination that people should just let go because things are too hard. But when things get competitive, we have one of two options. We can dig our heels in and silo ourselves and just try to be the best, or we can actually open up and say, how do we work better together with others in a way that allows us to reinforce what it is we are good at, but also acknowledge what we are not so good at, and finding those partners that can complement the work that we do. And so I think that's super tricky. I also don't think it's hard. I mean, I said earlier that I have so many issues with the word innovation or radical, or, you know, at Arts Commons 2 years ago, we had Arts Commons, the Calgary Philharmonic Orchestra, and Theatre Calgary partner for the first time in our 40+ year history. And people's minds were blown. And I was like, guys, it's not that innovative, right? It's not that hard, but it requires a lot of checking our egos and saying, in order for us to work with others, we need to, it's just, it's flexing a different muscle and it's redefining a different version of leadership.
And Alex, I'll just jump in to say, like, what we're doing as honestly embracing that very spirit of collaboration as part of the new strategic plan at Soulpepper, which is basically saying that we can't do this alone, and we have people around us, and we're going to be announcing some, exciting collaborations coming up soon. But that is really the answer. Is it in collaboration? And it's scary, no doubt. It's not going to be an easy path, but I think our leadership is certainly convinced that that is the way to go, because again, drawing on the resources, the capacity, the expertise of a whole bunch of people, of a whole bunch of organizations, and using that to move forward, rather than siloing ourselves and digging our heels in and saying we just have to succeed on our own.
Also, nobody like we keep on talking about silos, like our audience members, your audience members, my donors, your donors. Guess what? That's not how they think. And so, I keep on saying, artists do not create in silos. Audiences do not consume in silos. Why are we so precious about siloing ourselves when that's not how the world works anymore? Sorry, that's my soapbox. I'll get off now.
No, I think that's a really great final statement. We could talk all day and night, I think, about these things. It's been a really wonderful conversation. We do have to wrap it up. A big thank you to Alex Sarian for sharing some of the big ideas in your book with us, for answering all the questions from the audience. It seems like we have critical mass for an Alex Sarian fan club. People have been saying in the chat that they are belonging to the unofficial Alex Sarian fan club. Thank you to Rohan for your excellent moderating skills today, and also congratulations on the Soulpepper's exciting new strategic plan. It's been a really engaging conversation, and so much lessons. Yesterday and this morning, I was at the partnership conference, which is a not-for-profit and corporate partners discussion. Now, a lot of corporations that were there were talking about how they are adopting social purpose as a philosophy, which is replacing their corporate social responsibility, or ESG departments, within their corporate cultures. And it seems to me that this is a lot of the same conversation, that we are essentially asking arts organizations to adopt a sense of social purpose, how we serve our communities as that central tenet, as the North Star in everything we do. And if we can do that, we will not only be more relevant to our audiences, but also to corporate partners and to funders who see their social purpose as aligning with our own. So really insightful. Thank you. A final thank you to Power Corporation of Canada, who is the presenting partner of the Business and Arts Speaker Series. And if you want to learn about any of Business and Arts programs and events, please head to the Business and Arts website for more information, or follow us on social media. Many thanks, and have a wonderful day, everyone.